Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to Project Engineer. This is Sarah Dasco. We're doing another interview here with a project manager, and today we have a special guest, Paul Robinson. He is a senior consultant and partner with Corporate Oasis Inc. He brings over 25 years of experience in the IT industry, having worked with a number of large multinational organizations and serves as an advisory board member for several technology startups. Paul retains a Bachelor's of Science degree in Computer Science and Mathematics and retains certificates in Project Management, PMP, Business Analysis, CBAP, Business Relationship Management, BRMP, Service Management, ITIL, and is a member of CMC Canada. He's also an experienced instructor, having taught Business Relationship Management and Project Management certification classes throughout Canada. Welcome, Paul.
Good morning.
We're happy to have you here.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So at Project Engineer, our goal is to help project managers every day become better at what they do. And we would love to hear just from your personal experience regarding our topic today, which is the project charter. This is something that's obviously very important to project managers and to every project. So let's jump in. Let's start with what prompted you to become a project manager in the first place.
Well, it's interesting. I started in my career back in the mid-'80s, and back in the old days when we were all using mainframe technology. And back then, it was clear to me that technology was moving away from mainframes. And I thought, boy, I really got to stay on top of my game, get involved in a little bit more of the distributed computing. So I moved from mainframe over to local area networking. And I thought, man, you know what? I think I got it nailed now. I'm going to be the best Novell guy out there. And sure enough, after a few years, it became pretty clear that Novell was going the way of the dinosaurs. So I started looking at other technologies, and I thought, okay, you know what? Really like what I see with what Nortel's doing with their networking. I'm going to be like a Nortel system. And sure enough, that went the way of the dodo. So I thought, the universe is telling me something here, right? I'm trying to fill my bathtub up with water, but the plug is pulled. Yeah. And so it became clear that I have been spending too much time getting really romantic about the technology, and I really should be, instead of trying to fill this technology window that's sliding over time, I should be building vertically. And what I did was I looked at a little bit less of the technology that I've been focusing on, more about the methodologies, and it became clear that the one skill that transcended all the technology that I've been working on over time was project management. And now I can take that skill and all of the things that I've been working on, I can build from previous knowledge, as opposed to constantly trying to fill up that bathtub. If I worked on a project in the 80s or 90s, in the 2000s, it's just as relevant, because all of the issues and risks and constraints that I had been working with on the previous projects still applied. Right. So it's a really good way for me to look at my career and say, this is how I want to build upwards, instead of looking at just the technology. And there's nothing to say there's nothing wrong with people who want to work on the technology side if they're willing to keep filling that bathtub. Yeah, because that's what you got to do.
Yeah, technology is always changing, right? So that's an interesting way to get involved with project management. And now you have your own company, Corporate Oasis. Can you tell me about your company and the type of clients you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. So we started in the early 2000s, around 2006, initially small to medium-sized enterprises in the Alberta space, and primarily focusing on project management, whether it was building out practices for clients or doing staff augmentation. Since that time, we've expanded to Toronto and Vancouver, and we've also created our pillars around professional development, so training and education, practice leadership, and also professional services. So now we can have the conversation with our clients that's beyond just project management. We can be talking to them about the business relationship management, change management, business analysis. So one of the things that I think makes us unique is that we can have that conversation around helping organizations build their practices and helping them to mature those practices over time, and helping them to staff up those roles as well.
Right. And are your clients in the IT industry? Are they government agencies? Are they across the board? Tell me about them.
Pretty much 80% of them would be technology related. At least the organizations that we work with could be across the board, but the individuals that we're working with within those organizations are mostly IT.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Do you remember the first project you ever worked on?
Yeah, it was actually a mainframe project. But the funny thing is, back in the 80s, we didn't really talk about project management. We didn't talk about service management or business analysis or business relationship management. It was, Paul, just go make this happen and go do it.
Yeah.
And, being right out of school back then, out of university, I thought, okay, roll up my sleeves and make it happen. And what I didn't realize at the time was I was managing a project. And it's interesting, I think one of the things that they did have really mature back in the mainframe days was the fact that they had a lot of methodology that they had built up over time, but they just didn't label it. They just did stuff. When they threw the mainframes on the loading dock and got rid of them back in the old days, they also got rid of a lot of the methodologies, and it went away. And we lost a lot of maturity throughout the 90s. It's come back over time, but that's one of the reasons that we formed this company, was to help push the needle in the right direction.
Yeah, yeah. And what's one of the projects that you're currently working on?
Right now, I'm actually working on the Amazon head office for Canada. It's one of the projects I'm working on. It's interesting. The project is called The Post in Vancouver, and it's the old post office. And what we're doing is we're looking at moving Amazon into the business floors, and then the lower floors on the front facing on the sidewalk will be all small business. And then we're building residential towers on top. Now, the company that I'm working with it owns the project, and I'm doing some project work on that, mainly working with them to help out build their development practices and processes around real estate development, construction, and operational transitioning.
Awesome. Okay, so with that context, that background, understanding who you are, where you're coming from, how you got here, let's jump into our topic, which is the project charter. And we are referencing the blog that Bernie Rozecki from ProjectEngineer wrote, which is on our website if anyone wants to check that out. But let's get your opinion on just project charter in general. How would you define the project charter?
So I think of the project charter as really my North Star, guiding the guiding artifact, the guiding collateral for the project. So really, when you're looking at the project plan ultimately is an outcome of the charter. It tells you why you're doing the project. The project plan tells you how you're going to do it.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, good. What do you think is the most important element to include in the project charter?
Well, definitely the why statement. Why are we doing this? Because ultimately, I should be able to lift up that document and hand it to anybody who comes onto the project cold and say, read this. You'll get an understanding of not just what we're doing or how we're going to do it, but why are we doing it? And anytime we build out any project communication to the teams, anytime we're onboarding people, anytime we have to go back and look at scope or issues or risks, we should be able to reference the charter. It should be a very simple, crisp document that's easily accessible and stands on its own without a lot of speaking to it.
Awesome, yeah. How often do you create a project charter?
You know what? I actually create one for every project, but in some cases it's just a page. But I think you always have to have that North Star. A small project, large project, you really should have something. You don't even have to really call it a charter if it's a really small project, but it should be something that tells you about why and who's the sponsor, and who, from a governance perspective, who owns the project.
Right.
Yeah.
So how have project charters been helpful to you on past projects?
Usually when it comes to scope. Every time you work on a project, somebody's going to come up and go, but I want this. I thought you were doing that. You're giving me what I asked for, not what I want.
Yeah.
And that happens all the time, every project. So you need to be able to go back to the charter and say, well, okay, I get it. I understand what you're saying. My job as a PM is never to say no, but it is to say yes, but, or yes, and. So if you do want to make changes to the scope of the project, we'll entertain it. We'll take it back to the sponsor. We'll go to the steerco. It'll go under change control. And we'll see what that does to our schedule and finances. But that's usually where we have to go back. It's for scope. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think you're alone in saying that either. It seems to be a common theme.
Scope creep. Yep. Yeah. Or gold plating is another one where people just, they want more and more and more, which, hey, that's fine. It's just time and money.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna share my screen for 1 second here, just because the list is a little bit long to reference. We've got the 12 elements, as Bernie Rozecki pointed out. And kind of like you said, I mean, a project charter is going to be customized to what makes sense for the project. So people might use a mini charter or something else. But again, referencing this blog, these are the 12 elements that Bernie had listed as pretty substantially making up what the project charter generally is.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to look at this list, what would you say, would you change, add, what would you say about this list in general?
Well, one thing that I would add is something called a RACI. For those who aren't familiar with that, it's basically a very, very small grid that you would include in the charter. And what it would do from a governance perspective, it tells you for each of the stakeholder types, maybe right down to the name, but usually by title or group, it'll tell you who's accountable, which is the A, who's responsible, which is the R. They're the ones that are going to get the stuff done. Who do we need to communicate to and get information from throughout the project, which is the C. And then who do we just need to inform, which is where we're pushing information out, and that's the I. So that's the RACI, RACI. I think every project charter should have one. I don't see it in here. I do see information relating to stakeholder engagement, but I think having that one little table in there that's really simple, that just says who's involved to what aspect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is really important. That's what I would add to this list.
Okay. Yeah. Awesome. So I'll stop sharing that. We'll talk about the project purpose or justification next here. A quote from the blog says, when everyone knows why the project is being performed, they can be laser focused on the end result, which is kind of what you were saying just a minute or two ago, that we need to have the why. That's the most important part of the project charter, in your opinion. So question for you, how does knowing why motivate a team?
Well, once you know why you're doing what you're doing, I think you'll always do a better job of doing what you do if you know why you're doing it. Mm-hmm. And that applies to everything in life. If you know why you're doing it, you're going to be motivated. You're going to put more of a focus on the quality, and you're going to lean into it. And also, if things aren't happening the way you think they should be in order to achieve that why, you're going to have a better understanding of if you're getting a little bit off course. So basically what it does is it allows individuals and teams to map their actions to solving an opportunity, solving a problem, okay, or achieving a gain or a goal or an opportunity. And those are the whys. Why do I want to solve this problem? Why do I want to achieve this goal? So now I know my actions to achieve that, and I'll do a better job just in life in general and also on projects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do you ensure you've clearly communicated the project purpose or justification?
Usually what I do is I create sort of a sounding board, and I test with a small group of stakeholders. So what I'll do is, it's sort of like the concentric circles on a project. There's the nucleus of the core team. So the core team I use to create the message. And then what I'll do is I'll take that message and I'll go out to the next group and then test that message. Do they get it? Did they understand it? Do I have any feedback? And really, really look hard for feedback. You know, feedback is a gift, especially early in the project. So if you can get their feedback and they can articulate to you why they're not getting it, why we don't understand, why we think there needs to be more clarity, then you take it out to the next level. It's very iterative, but it's wash, rinse, repeat. Just keep sending the message out and keep looking for feedback.
Mm-hmm. And how did you determine these concentric circles? Do you just know who's most closely related to the project, who's most influential on the project, or does it change?
No, that's a really good question. Actually, you know what? It comes back to the RACI. You start with the people who are accountable at the core. Mm-hmm. Then you move out to the people who are responsible for getting the job done. Then you move out to the people who you need to communicate to on a regular basis. And then you communicate out to the broader stakeholder group. So I really think of the RACI. It's almost, when you look at the concentric circles, it's almost ARCI.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So in using RACI as your model there.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the thing is, if you don't start with the right group, if you start with the wrong group, yeah, you test it on them, you could end up getting the message twisted and contorted. So by the time you go back to the people who are accountable for the project, they're actually not getting it.
Yeah.
So so you have to start with the core, which is the A, and then R, and then C, and then I. And then the I could be everybody in the organization, depending on the type of project you're working on.
Mm-hmm. And feedback is collected through surveys, interviews, emails, that kind of thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And try and get as much real-time information as you can, because people aren't going to respond to surveys. They're not going to respond
Yeah.
to emails. But if you can get invited to their team meetings,
Mm-hmm.
that's gold, right? Just say, hey, you know what, working on this project, if we can take 15 minutes of your next team meeting,
Yeah.
Everybody's going to be there. I'd love to share what we're doing. Try and get that interaction going. It's a little harder with COVID, but you can still do it.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's move on to the second thing, the measurable project objectives and related success criteria. How would you define project objectives?
I think of project objectives as capabilities, and people get kind of stuck on what's the difference between an outcome or an objective, and I think of it as a capability. Here's the stuff that we can do at the end of the project that we couldn't do before. We can sell this product online. We can reach out to this customer base. We have an office that we can work in we didn't have before. So I think of it in terms of capabilities. That way you're not kind of getting wrapped around the axle around is this a deliverable? Is it an outcome? Is it people just get stuck on words sometimes. Just think of it as a capability and keep it really, really simple. And as much as possible, those capabilities should be tangible and measurable if you can. So don't think of it in terms of, well, if we implement this tool, productivity will go up. It really doesn't mean much, because especially if you're paying for staff anyway, they're just going to be doing something else. You have to be able to look at things in terms of how will this improve the profitability of the organization? How does it change the top end and the bottom end of our financials? How does it change the way people work in a meaningful way, in a measurable way? How do we get access to markets that we couldn't before? Those are the things you should be asking, not just it's okay to have subjective and intangible, but if that's all you got, it's going to be very difficult at the end of the project to determine if you were successful.
Yeah. And on that note, how do you identify your success criteria?
KPIs and capabilities. So again, as much as possible, these should be measurable. So what kind of key performance indicators are on the project should we be looking at? And when I say that, I don't mean how can we track the budget or the schedule of the project. I mean, how can we look at KPIs within the organization today that would change later? So what key performance indicators within the company now would change? So for example, if you're looking at an airport, one of the things you might be looking at is a new baggage carousel or a baggage tracking system. Okay, well, how quickly does that get the bags to the customer? And how does that affect our error rate in individuals not getting their luggage at all, or individuals having their luggage sent to other locations? Those can all be measured, right? But if you just measure it in terms of, well, we want to make sure we have happier customers, that's a tough one, right? Yeah. But there's a lot of numbers you can put around that. So I think it's about KPIs, it's about numbers. Really important on the project, get your KPI baseline before you start your project. What are the KPIs looking at like today, so that when we get to the end of the project, we can go back and compare. If you don't have them at the beginning, it's very difficult to go back afterwards and say, well, what are we comparing to? Like, we've got the numbers, but that doesn't mean anything because we didn't actually take a baseline at the beginning.
So what if a project doesn't have the KPI baselines and they're not able to do it because the project needs to start? Is there a workaround or a suggestion for that?
Sometimes you can go off of anecdotal information. Like if you don't have the KPIs, there's some cases absolutely where we can't measure things today because we simply don't have a way of measuring them. And the project will actually end up delivering the systems that allow us to measure. So I think that needs to go into the charter as a constraint, that, we have a constraint that we don't currently have a baseline of KPIs, and that's an understanding, or maybe put it down as an assumption if you're not sure. But as long as you have that in your back pocket as a means to defend that the project should continue, that's really important. Just ask yourself, as a PM, it's always important to ask yourself, put yourself in the future, 6 months or 12 months or 18 months out, whenever the project's finished. Will I be able to defend that this project is successful? And you should keep asking that question.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because I think a lot of people that I work with, when they're doing the project charter, they really stop listing the success criteria at what you said, project budget, project schedule, and maybe a couple of quality items, right? And I always push for more. There's got to be something there's got to be something more to this that will really mean this is a successful project. But it's hard to get people to that point, I think. So this is
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, your project can't just be successful because it was delivered on time, on budget. That's not the definition of success. It can fail because your project wasn't delivered on time and on budget. It can certainly fail because of that. But if all you did was delivered something on time and on budget, the question is, who cares?
Yeah.
Why? What did you really do?
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so let's move on to the next component here, the high-level requirements. What tools and techniques do you use to collect high-level requirements?
So I'm assuming when we say high level, we're just talking about the requirements that would be in the charter that would ultimately be, So again, it comes back to the RACI. Start with the core team, like the steering committee and the sponsor. Okay, why are you doing this? And the way I do it is I keep asking why. It's like peeling an onion. First question is, why do we want to achieve this? If somebody says, I need to buy a drill, no, you don't need to buy a drill. You need a hole in that piece of wood, right? But you don't need to buy a drill. The drill is a solution. But what are you really trying to achieve here? Well, we need a hole in this piece of wood. Okay, well, let's talk about that. Right? Maybe there's ways we can do that. You know, we can use a gun. I don't know, but right, like there's ways, right? There's different ways. So let's not talk about the drill. Let's talk about what you're trying to do. And that's your very, very high level requirement. That's your why. That's your guiding North Star. And there should be like only one or two comments around that why statement. When you get past the why statement and into the next level, which should still be in the charter, it's what supports those why statements. So, okay, I need a hole in this piece of wood. Great. Why? Why do you need a hole in a piece of wood? Oh, okay. Well, because what we need to do is we need to take this and we need to mount it on the wall so we can hang a picture. Oh, so what you're really trying to do is you want to hang a picture. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I forgot to mention. That's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to hang a picture. But you told me you needed to buy a drill. Right. Okay. No, sorry. This project is all about hanging a picture. Okay. Now I get it. So let's reverse engineer that. If we keep peeling the layers of the onion, now we can figure out, you want to hang a picture. What kind of picture, right? How big is the picture? Let's get to the point where we at least understand the major components that support the why statement. And then we can stop there, because when we get into the project, we can go even further. Is this a painting? Is it already painted? Are you hiring somebody to paint it? Don't know. But you told me you needed a drill.
Yeah, that's a great way to get at what the core of the project actually is, instead of everything else that people kind of quickly assume and put onto the project just because that's how it's always been done.
Well, see, this is the problem, is people love to solution. They love to talk about how they're going to do things and what they're going to do, but they keep forgetting about why. And that's just human nature. But you really got to watch out for solutioning in the charter. You know, if you are getting to the point where you're talking about implementing a specific product, you really got to take a step back and go, are we sure that that's really what we're trying to do here? Because why?
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's kind of, I think, answering this next question about how important the high level requirements are, because it's drilling back to the why.
Yeah, and keep it simple. Really, the charter should be a very light read. So your high level requirements, keep it to half a dozen if you can, because your business analyst is going to take that and they're going to drill down, and they're going to break it into sub requirements and use cases and studies and processes. They're going to trace those requirements throughout the project, but at least the VA has something to go back to. That's the key. Keep it really simple.
So what expectations do you have about those requirements changing then? Should they change? Will they change?
No, never. No, I've never changed. Ever. I've never been on a project where the requirements have changed, or the scope, or the risks, or the schedule, or the budget. No, everything is going to change. When, I think it might have been Colin Powell who said the only time you know that your plan is perfect is at the end of the war. Like, that's the only time that you really have full visibility to everything. It's when you're actually signing off the project closure document. It's the only time you have visibility to everything. So the charter is, we would love to go to Disneyland, but you were going to drive. Do you think everything's going to go perfectly? Do you think you're going to run low on gas? Do you think the kids are going to be screaming in the back? Do you think that you're going to, like your credit card's going to bounce because you're in a foreign country and you forgot to tell them? Stuff's going to happen throughout the project all the time. And so 100% guarantee you'll have changes to your requirements. You'll probably have changes to your scope. If not changes, at least requests for changes to your scope.
For sure.
Even the PM could change, but be ready for change.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned a little bit earlier that sometimes, for example, the KPIs we talked about, if you don't have the baselines, that would go under something, potentially the assumptions and constraints section. So if we talk about that, when you think about assumptions, they're often subconscious. So how do you actually go about extracting that and getting people aware of their subconscious assumptions?
Definitely conversational. So what you need to do is you need to be able to work with the stakeholders to say, well, and again, keep asking the why questions. So state everything as an assumption initially. Everything is an assumption. And then go through it and then change to it's either a falsified assumption or it's a verified assumption. A verified assumption becomes a fact, and then that can go into your charter. A falsified assumption, in some cases, you still want to keep it in your charter to say an assumption was identified here, but it was falsified. And then that way, if someone else reads the charter, they can go, oh, we don't need to go down this path. We already did. So in some cases, if you've got an assumption and you determine that, no, that assumption is not appropriate, you still might want to keep it in there if you think the question is going to be asked later on. Can't hurt. But again, it's iterative, it's conversational, and treat everything at the beginning on the charter as an assumption. I assume I'm the PM. I assume that this project is being sponsored by somebody who can finance it. I assume that the resources are going to be available to me to do the project. I assume that within the scope of other projects in the portfolio, this one has actually been allocated. You know, I'm assuming everything. And then you just cherry pick, go through the whole list. This is a valid assumption. This is an invalid assumption. But just make everything an assumption at the beginning. Because in some cases, you might find out actually that this is somebody's pet project and it's not been allocated in the portfolio. And that happens.
Yeah. Okay. And then when you have, when you're working through your project, have you ever had experiences where you've learned about assumptions or constraints later on in the project? And what have you done about that?
Yeah, you know, it usually comes down to, like, it's easy for people to allocate money. Usually what they'll do is they'll say, yeah, we went to the steering committee or we went to the investment committee and we'll allocate these funds. That's fine. In a matrix organization where resources are shared between the operation of the organization and projects, usually what you'll find is that the issues are going to come down to resource availability. You told me that I was going to have Fred and Steve and Mary and Frank for this project available 50% of the time. I'm not getting their time. Why am I not getting it? Well, we've had other priorities, other projects, stuff come up. It's always about this conversation between the project manager and the functional managers. And there's always this constant negotiation around, you know, I'll get a call on a Friday and somebody will say, hey, something's popped up. You can't have Steve for the next month. Okay, so who can I have? Or can we sit down with the sponsors for both of the projects? That's the perfect world. Is if I can get my sponsor to sit down with your sponsor and they can negotiate, because if it really determines at that level that there's a resource constraint, they can open up the pocket and get an interim contractor to come in to help, or they can balance the resources out in a way that helps the project but pushes the schedule out. It's usually around human resources available.
Yeah. And not always getting that commitment up front guarantees their commitment throughout the project, like you said, change.
Yeah, it's easy to commit the funds, but it's harder for a functional manager to commit the resources because their world changes every day.
Yeah.
Look at COVID, right? I've got a project in February. It's financially, it's funded. Resources are allocated. Everything's set aside. Everything's working. And in March, I'm told you don't have any resources. We're all focusing on work from home right now.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. I can deal with that. Now it's a risk, or at least it's an issue. I can push out my schedule. I can do whatever, but I have to respond to that somehow.
Yeah. So talking about the next element here of the project charter, the high-level project description and boundaries, this would be the rough draft, if you will, of the scope. So how do you include this in a way that captures what the stakeholder wants?
I use the KISS principle, keep it simple. I don't usually like you saying the second S. Keep it simple. So be clear on what's being delivered, but what's really, really important and almost nobody ever does is tell me what you're not delivering. And that's so important. Like
Yeah.
the scope statement shouldn't just be, here's what we're going to do on the project. It should be, here's what's in scope and here's what's clearly out of scope. We're not doing this. So for example, if we're doing a due diligence project, we're doing some analysis on business processes and we're going to do an RFP for a product that can support those processes. That's great. But tell me that you're not going to be buying the product and implementing it in this phase, right? Tell me that that's not in scope. Because if I assume that it's in scope and you didn't specifically state the assumption and you didn't state that it was out of scope, my assumption is you're probably going to go out and buy it and implement it. And when we get close to the end of the project, I'm going to say, well, where is it? And you're going to come back and go, we're not doing it. Well, I didn't know we weren't doing it. And I signed off on the charter and I thought we were. So that's the problem with assumptions is you don't know when you're making them, right? So that's why it's clearly state, we're not doing this.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so important. I think, again, I agree. When I've worked with teams in developing the project charter, it's difficult to get them to think of exclusions and to remember to actually write it down, because you might have it in your mind at one point in time,
right?
And then 6 months, 1 year later, whenever the project's done, you forgot that wasn't part of the project. Or like you said, if it was an unwritten expectation, now you're at the end of the project waiting for something to happen and it doesn't. People are
exactly
around who's responsible.
Well, you know, and that's another good point too. This isn't really related to the charter, but I think it's a good practice is that throughout the project, do take those notes like you just said, and do mini retrospectives. The worst thing you can do on a project is to not do a lessons learned. The second worst thing you can do is do a lessons learned at the end, because most people have forgotten about the lessons, or the team has been disbanded and you can't get their attention. But as you're learning things, track it down, right? Oh, there's an assumption here. Oh, this is out of scope. You know, oh, there's a lesson here that I need to share with another project manager. Why wait 18 months? Share it with them now. Yeah.
Yeah. So that can also turn into risks, which is our next element here, high level risks. If you don't do those kind of things, you can be hit with a risk and then you're just trying to react on the spot. So when you think about the project charter, how detailed would you say your risk planning is at that stage in the project?
It should be very, very high level. So, you know, keep it to the milestone level. Your risks, what are your major risk categories? And just try and keep it to that. So what are the risks to the scope changing? What are the risks to the schedule? What are the risks to the resource availability? What are the risks to the financials? Maybe the top 5 elements of the project, keep it really simple, because you are going to have more risks over time. But at least when people sign off on the charter, they know that you've thought about it. And the other thing to keep in mind with risks, that the definition of a risk is the chance that something will happen. Now, that's not necessarily something bad. Could be a risk that's good. But there's a chance. So the way to look at risk is, what's the probability that this will happen? And when it happens, when that risk probability becomes 100%, what's the impact? So you need to look at both. There's some things that could have a very, very, very low probability of happening, but the impact is huge, right? Like a pandemic. What are the chances, right? But the impact is massive, probability is low, which turns out to be a high risk. When you multiply the probability by the impact, it's very high. There's other things that have a very, very high probability of happening, but the impact is low. So, you know, those are the ones you probably don't need to care about. But when you look at the combination of the probability and the impact, those are the ones you need to target in your charter. Is that chances are it'll happen, and chances are the impact will be high. And then also put something in there around what will be your response? How will you try to mitigate that and get in front of it before it happens?
Now, you mentioned, I think you mentioned 5 things. You said risk to scope, risk to schedule, risk to cost, and risk to finances available. Was there a 5th one that you mentioned, or were you just giving examples?
No, I'm just giving examples. Like when I say top 5, it's like maybe don't keep it to, you know, don't make it any more than 5. You know, for sure you want your iron triangle. You want scope and schedule and cost.
Yeah.
You know, those are the big 3. But then I would add in maybe a couple of more around, you know, human factors like, you know, resource availability and other things related to unknowns that could be relevant to this project. But if you're getting into 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10, you're probably going too far.
Gotcha. Okay, that's what you were saying. Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense, because it's not, this isn't your risk planning and everything. You're still trying to keep it
Right.
to, yeah, high level.
Yep. What are the things that are likely to happen, high probability, and what are the things that when they happen will have an high impact,
Mm-hmm.
and what am I going to do to get in front of it?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's keep going. The other thing we're going to include in the project charter is the summary milestone schedule.
Mm-hmm.
So a similar question here. What would you include? How detailed is this? And how do you decide what's a milestone or what's not?
Well, I actually have probably a fairly unique way of describing a milestone.
Okay.
And I think it's something to celebrate. That's how I define a milestone. It's like, at what point can I say we're all going to get out and celebrate because we hit this thing, whatever it is, right? And that's not usually because we got through a design gate into a development phase or anything like that. It's usually because, hey, we got our first iteration out the door, or hey, we've passed QA and UAT and we're ready to deploy, or we finished warranty. Those are all celebrations. That's how I look at it. Now, I could be wrong, but usually it's. When I define something, I usually ask myself, well, what's the opposite? And if a milestone isn't something to celebrate, well, then why not? Right?
Yeah.
That's how I look at it. It's a very soft definition, but the reason I use it is because it can apply to any type of project.
Yeah, and it also seems like there's some human motivator factor built into that too. That if those are the celebratory moments, the team is looking forward to them and driving towards them. And know, like you said, they have got something to celebrate at that point. So
everybody's leaned into it. Exactly, right? They've leaned hard, they pushed hard, they hit that milestone. Let's celebrate that, because the other thing is, once you do the celebration, it's kind of a defining moment where you can sort of say, now we've officially moved into the next milestone.
Yeah. Okay, that's nice. I like that definition. I think I'm going to adopt that. We're going to talk about budget for a second, and
Sure.
If I can ask you a personal question. So in your experience with your projects, who would typically decide, assign, or provide a budget for your projects? Do you come up with it, or are you given the broad parameters for that?
So it can depend. The worst case scenario is when somebody says, I've got $100,000 and it's like the drill, right? I want to buy a drill. Here's $20. I want to go buy a drill. That's the worst case scenario, is when they say, oh, we've allocated some money, go figure out the project. Because you got to ask yourself, where did that come from? Right? So there needs to be something that happens pre-charter. There needs to be something that happens before the charter is signed off, and maybe even before the charter is created, at the investment committee level, some kind of discovery or feasibility or due diligence that should happen to determine A, if the project is viable, B, where the project fits within other projects, and C, how much is it going to cost, and how long is it going to take. Those things should really all kind of be happening initially at the discovery phase, even before you determine that you're going to projectize it, even before you get to the charter. So the work that goes into that on the financial side would be things like learning from other projects that are similar would be a big one. Another one would be tribal knowledge around the organization, where people have done things in other organizations or they've learned things that would apply. And then, of course, then you take into your financials things like your cost of resources, whether they're full-time or contract, infrastructure costs, software costs, any of those factors. So usually what I'll do is I'll just break down the cost categories, and then I'll put some kind of swag. You know what swag stands for, right? No. Super wild something guess.
Oh yeah, yes, I've heard that. Okay, you reminded me.
So it's an order of magnitude estimate, and I call it. It's kind of a classification of financials that you refine over time. So I call a Class C estimate in my world would be like plus 50% accurate, minus 25% accurate, and you state that in your estimate. You state this could vary as much as, or it could be 100% plus 100% minus 50%. But as you move through the project, that number should get refined so that it's maybe plus 10% minus 5, and plus 5 minus 2. So it's this band that narrows over time. But at the beginning, you need to have contingency in there, because there's a lot of assumptions. There's things you don't know. So the best thing you can do is to learn from previous projects and do your due diligence before you even get into the charter. So
I've got a million questions right now running through my head.
Okay.
I'm going to start with a simple one first. So you said use the ROM here, the 50, plus 50 minus 25.
Mhm.
Are there specific points in the project where you would expect that to go down, or do you just customize it to the project as fits?
Well, again, it's around the milestones, right? When you get to a milestone and you start moving into the next one, that's a really, really good time after you've all sobered up from your celebration. It's a really good time to sit down and say, okay, deep breath, everybody sit down. Let's look at the rest of the project. Let's go back and look at our financials. Let's go back and look at our resource availability, and let's refine our forecast. So our estimate to complete and our estimate at complete and our forecasted variance. Let's look at that objectively and say, does it need to change? And, how can we go from plus 50%, minus 25% in the first phase, get past that milestone, get into the next phase, and now, okay, ideally we want to see if we can get plus 20, minus 10. But I would base it on the milestones, because those are really good points in the project to sit down and refactor those things. And also look at everything, not just the financials. Our risks going forward, do they change? It's a good time in the project to get a whiteboard out, sit down and look at everything, and then push to the next milestone completion.
Mm-hmm. Now, we don't have a lot of time left, but I need to ask this question before moving on, because you said that the worst case is somebody says, here's $20, go buy a drill, do the project. Yeah. And for me, I mean, that's almost the best case scenario, because then I can just figure out the project and I can just run away with it. So I'm curious to know, first of all, because most of the projects I get are, I need a drill, you figure out the costs, you tell me the cost, then I'll let you know if I'll approve it. And then you do the project. So to me, I mean, those drive me a little crazy. But what's your best case scenario then, if that's the worst case?
Well, for me, coming back to the worst case, the reason it's the worst case was because it never was about the drill. Right. So right, here's $20, go buy a drill. Okay, I'm on eBay and I'm on Kijiji and I'm looking around trying to get the best deal on the drill, and I come back and I go, hey, good news, I got you a drill and I saved you $10. And they come back and go, well, where's my picture?
Right, okay, gotcha.
Right, so that's the worst case, because they've already anchored in on some number and they've anchored in on some deliverable without even having done the due diligence. Best case scenario is where they say, this would be Nirvana. Here's the problem statement. Here's why we need this project. Here's the opportunity that we are trying to take advantage of in the marketplace, or here's the new capabilities that we're looking to achieve, or here's the problem that we're trying to solve because we have these pain points. And then they give me those. Then I can go back and I can look at similar projects. I can go to sources of knowledge like Gartner. I can talk to my colleagues. There's all these things I can do. I can start interviewing people, and I can build up this story that tells me, if they know why, I can then tell the story about, now that I know the why, I can talk about what and when and how and who. And I can answer those questions. And that's a conversation. It's a back and forth. But then ultimately, once I've done that, then I can get that into the charter. So my perfect world is if they just come to me with a well-defined problem statement that talks all about why. But don't come to me with the numbers or the drills or the $20 bill or anything like that, because you've already solutioned. To me, that's a big red flag.
Yeah. That makes sense now that you're saying it that way. I'm glad I asked.
No, that's great. It's great.
So we have three elements left: the stakeholder list, project approval requirements, and the last one is the assigned project manager and project sponsor. So we've talked a little bit about all of them already. The project manager, like you said, having that racy was your approach to that, but at least having the assigned project manager and project sponsor signing off. So let's talk a little bit more about the stakeholder list, because that one can be a little bit more custom fit to each project. How many stakeholders would you typically see at the project level?
Well, there isn't really a specific number. It can vary so much. But what I can say is that the roles are usually the same throughout most projects. So you're going to have a sponsor. The sponsor is the one that cares the most about the project and carries the bag of money. So there should be one sponsor. If there isn't one sponsor, it could be at least a small committee that can serve as an individual, right, and make a decision. So that's what you're looking for, is decisions. So then from the sponsor down, think of it like a tree. The next one is going to be some form of steering committee. which again, it's fit for purpose. Steering committee could just be the sponsor and the project manager, and maybe a portfolio lead or one other individual. Project manager is not there to make decisions, but they're just to record and take direction. And then there's the leadership team. And then of course, then you've got your core team that's going to execute. They're the ones that are the R and the A in the RACI. And then you've got basically a big bucket, which could be the broader stakeholder community. But I try to keep the tree, no matter how big the project is, to only 3 or 4 levels. Sponsor, steering committee, leadership team, and then the core team, and then the broader stakeholder group. So it's a very, very small pyramid of maybe 5 levels, and it's usually the same for all projects.
Okay, well, that's awesome. I love that visual that you get with that as well. A lot of people are visual learners, and it helps remember, like, it helps us remember, okay, when I go to make that, it isn't about the number, but it is, like you said, about the roles, make sure all the levels are there. That's the most important thing. As
long as there's representation, the numbers don't really matter.
Yeah.
You could be building a new aircraft or a nuclear power plant, or you could be hanging a picture on the wall.
Yeah. Just be a little bit of a thinner tree.
Exactly.
Okay. So thank you so much for joining us, Paul. This was excellent. I was taking notes the whole time. I'll be reviewing them. We're doing a teaching webinar on this, so I'll be referencing you in this interview. And I really appreciate you taking the time to.
No, I appreciate it. It's always great to be able to share knowledge, and one thing to keep in mind is that, we're all always learning. And, I've been doing this for 30 years now, 35 years. And every project I come away with something different. I've never done the same project twice. So, always remember, we're all humble students. We're always learning. And, one day, hopefully whoever's watching this will be able to pay it forward.
Awesome. And on that note, thank you everyone for watching, for joining us. You can check out the blog. You can see how Bernie's wrapped up the project charter, and any other questions you have, you can always contact us online. I'm Sarah Dasco with Project Engineer. Thanks for joining us, everyone.